In Gabriel Garcia Marquez's novel, 100 Years of Solitude, Jose Arcadio Segundo is the only survivor of a massacre. When soldiers open fire on a demonstration, he is hit and loses consciousness. He wakes on a train, packed among thousands of bodies bound for clandestine burial at sea. He jumps off and begins the long walk home, stopping when he reaches a house just outside his town, where a woman tends his wound and washes his bloodied clothes. When Segundo says what he has witnessed, she refuses to believe him. "There haven't been any dead here," she said. "Since the time of your uncle, the colonel, nothing has happened in Macondo." His own brother doesn't believe him either, and anyone who does speak of the events tells him an entirely different story. There were no dead. The satisfied workers had gone back to their families, and the banana company was suspending all activity until the rains stopped. There's a hole. There's a hole in that story. There's a hole in the story of David. In the story of David moving the Ark of the Covenant into his new capital. It's possible to glide right over it if we don't pay attention to the verse numbers in the assigned reading from the lectionary. But once we know there's something uncomfortable hiding in the gap, the story has a distinct before and after quality to it. Before, Uzzah and Ahio walk proudly to their places at the cart, carrying the ark, eager to take their role. There's a festive buzz in the air as the band begins to play, the cart moves forward, and the whole house of Israel, as the text tells us, dances with their king in a flash mob of joy and reverence. After, the celebration is muted. The cart drivers gravely take their places, a single trumpet plays, and David dances alone. Why? And where have Uzzah and Ahio gone? What happens in the gap is this. As the oxen pull the cart forward, it jolts, and the ark tips or slides. Uzzah reaches out and takes hold of the ark to steady it, and God strikes him dead because of that single gesture, meant to protect the ark from harm. In response, David is afraid of the Lord and asks, "How can the ark of the Lord come into my care?" If we read what's in the gap, the subdued tone of the second procession of the ark begins to make sense. The omission of Uzzah's death and David's response effectively creates an official version of the story. There haven't been any dead here, the official version declares. Nothing has happened in Macondo. What is lost when we skip over the difficult passages? Omitting Uzzah's death and David's response flattens, distorts the text. It can be read as a fairly straightforward story about David's faithfulness and leadership. He's simply moving the ark into Jerusalem in order to place God at the center of the life of Israel. David's motivations may be rooted in faith, but it may also be that David has his own interests in mind. Bringing the ark into his newly established capital might serve to boost the city's reputation, consolidate his political power. The missing verses hint at David's mixed motives. When David expresses fear after Uzzah's death, we see him in a moment of humility and self-reflection, perhaps considering the danger of claiming the presence of holiness for one's own purposes, perhaps lamenting that the cost was a human life. It's a moment of grief and moral struggle. But the moment passes. After hearing that the ark's presence was a blessing to the household where he left it after Uzzah died, David decides he would like to have it in his city after all. He seems to give not another thought to Uzzah, not another moment to consider the weight of responsibility that comes with the power God has given him. I've always appreciated the discipline of preaching from the lectionary. I've talked to all of you about that before. Taking these assigned texts throughout the course of the church year, listening to them to hear God's word for this present moment. If verses are omitted from a passage, I certainly read them in preparation, and I might mention them in preaching, but often I've just gone along with the text as the lectionary presents it. But this one feels different. Omitting Uzzah's death and David's response changes the story. It also echoes a pattern we've seen too often: the erasure of the truth, the justification of a death because the killer holds a position of authority and trust. George Floyd's killer was convicted of murder, but if Darnella Frazier, that young woman, young teenage girl, had not borne the pain of witnessing Floyd's death and filming it, there would have been a hole in the story. And many of us would have taken the story as it was given to us. People of color and immigrants have long borne the pain of witnessing unacknowledged violence, injustice, and trauma. Those of us with the choice to look or turn away are called to bear witness and to wrestle with the whole story. Because plenty has happened in Macondo, if we know the truth. David's name appears 13 times in 13 verses, and the Ark of God or the Lord shows up 14 times. But as we scan, another name appearing only once stands out. For a single moment, the spotlight turns to shine on Michal, daughter of Saul. After a cursory read, we might think Michal is just a wet blanket, a buzzkill foil to David's golden boy, warrior, king, musician, party animal. It's a day of extravagant ritual and celebration, and everyone else is singing, dancing, shouting, and rejoicing, with David dancing more wildly and singing more loudly than anyone. But here's Michal, sitting above it all with a scowl on her face. And she's not just mildly displeased or in a temporary funk. The text tells us she sees David's dancing and she despises him in her heart. I wonder how often someone hears this story and leaves with the impression that Michal is just a party pooper, just a wife caught up in petty jealousy. Because if we don't know Michal's history with David, and if we're only hearing this story as it is presented in the lectionary, without the death of Uzzah and David's reaction, it's hard to understand why Michal would despise David. He's the hero, right? But if we read a few verses further, we get another glimpse into Michal and David's relationship. Sure, Michal is not in any better mood in those verses, but when they talk, we see that David isn't exactly a prince. Well, he is king, but you know what I mean. We begin to see why Michal reacts with such bitterness to David's starring role in the festivities. For that brief moment, we're invited and challenged to know the truth, to see things from Michal's presence and perspective. While everyone else is singing, dancing, and shouting, Michal has another perspective. When we study the Gospels, we usually focus on the people who embrace the good news through Jesus. The shepherds, the Magi, Philip, Nathanael, Mary, Martha, Mary Magdalene, the Samaritan woman, Zacchaeus. These characters show us what belief looks like on the ground, what shapes our own spiritual lives might take, what joys the gospel might inspire if we receive it in faith. But what about the men and women in the New Testament who don't accept the good news? The people who encounter the gospel, hear its challenge, glimpse its beauty, but then turn away. What about the young rich man who leaves in sorrow when Jesus asks him to share his wealth? What about the people of Nazareth who refuse to look past Jesus' humble origins? What about the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the neighbors of the Gerasene demoniac? What about Pontius Pilate? What about Herod, who in this week's story from Mark finds himself greatly perplexed in the presence of John the Baptist? He's the man who likes to listen when John tells him the truth, who considers John a righteous and holy man, as the text tells us, who even dares to protect John from danger for a while, but in the end resists the call of the gospel, resists the truth, and kills the one who bears him good news. A faithless tetrarch forsakes his wife to marry his brothers. When a courageous truth-teller condemns the incestuous marriage, the truth-teller finds himself in protective custody in a prison cell. Soon, the tetrarch throws himself a birthday party, gets drunk, and invites his stepdaughter to dance for his guests. Her performance pleases him so much that he promises her anything she desires. The girl, spurred on by her mother, demands the imprisoned prophet's death. Unwilling to lose face in front of his guests, Herod keeps his promise and orders the truth-teller's execution. Before the birthday party is over, the girl receives the prophet's head on a platter. Where's the good news in this story? Where's the hope, the healing, the joy? We Christians are trained to slap all kinds of noble meanings onto tragedy. Nothing happens in this world unless God wills it. God never gives anyone more than they can bear. God's plans are always perfect, even when we don't understand them. But some sorrows, like those that surround John's death, still leave us reeling. They don't yield to our need for shape, sense, closure. So I wonder if Mark gives us this story for another reason. Not to reveal good news, but to show us what's at stake when the good news, when the truth is rejected. Maybe this is the story of what happens when we treat the truth too casually, too neutrally. When we approach Jesus with curiosity, perplexity, and maybe even fascination, but then get stuck, never crossing over from being a spectator to becoming a disciple. Mark tells us that Herod enjoys listening to John. Herod enjoys listening to a man who calls him an adulterer? Why? I think it's because the truth, sharp, hard-edged, and costly though it often is, compels us. It draws us in. In a world overrun with doctored images, fake headlines, exaggerated claims, and blatant lies, truth is precious. It draws our gaze, pricks our ears. It suggests to us that coherence and alignment are possible. We don't have to live in constant disharmony, our words, actions, and desires permanently in conflict. Something in us hungers for the truth. We fear it and need it all at once. My hunch is Herod spends hours at a time sitting by John's prison cell, listening to the truth that cuts in order to heal. Stuck between a rock and a hard place, lustful for power and yet dissatisfied with what power has made of him. He asks questions. He probes. Herod wonders. He hopes. He fears. He learns about Jesus, the one whose sandals John feels unworthy to untie. He asks about God, about baptism, forgiveness, and salvation. He compares the clear authenticity of John's mission and message to his own compromised, convoluted life. And maybe he yearns. But then the time comes to make a decision. Right over wrong, humility over power, integrity over compromise, truth over lies. The time comes to care more about saving a life than saving face. To move from a perplexed fascination with truth to a faithful stewardship of truth. What happens in the aftermath of Herod's birthday party is the testing of Herod's character, his loyalties, his mind, and his heart. The testing of his commitment to something costlier than the status quo. How different the story would be if Herod passed this test. But he fails. When push comes to shove, his casual fascination with the truth isn't enough to transform him. He remains a hearer of the good news, not a doer. I know I'm nothing like Herod. I've never put anyone to death. I've never sacrificed another human being to hang on to power. I've never committed murder to save face. But I wonder if the questions I need to ask myself in light of Herod's story are subtler ones. No, I don't go around killing people. But do I care too much about what other people think of me? Do I value my status, reputation, and popularity more than I do the truth? Am I so bent on conflict avoidance that I harm others with my passivity? Do I prefer stability and safety more than transformation? Is my inner life and my outer life misaligned, one always covering for the other? These are personal questions on the one hand, but very public ones on the other. When I choose silence for the sake of convenience, whose life becomes expendable? When I decide that justice is too messy, chaotic, or costly for me to pursue, who suffers in the long term? Whose vulnerability do I depend on and benefit from to keep my own comforts intact? These aren't good news questions if by good news we mean news that makes us feel good, but they are gospel questions. They're the questions I suspect John would ask. They're the questions I believe Jesus asked. They're the questions both men died for asking. To his credit, Herod begins in the right place. He begins with curiosity, perplexity, and desire. It's fine to begin where he does, as a listener, intrigued but uncommitted. The danger is in staying there, writes Debbie Thomas. The danger is in deciding that a disinterested fascination with Jesus Christ is enough. The danger is in silencing the truth that never stops trying to save us. Asking hard questions, seeking the truth, hearing the truth, and then facing a choice of what to do with the truth we've been told. That's the work of a disciple. What do we do with the truth we've been told? This truth that never stops trying to save us. What do we do with the truth we've been told? This truth that never stops trying to save us. Thanks be to God. Amen.